My name is Craig Bruner, and I will be one of the leads for the discussion on population structure and change. The first reading was entitled Population Geography by John Clark, and this was a brief overview of the numerous studies conducted on population redistribution, migration, and governmental policies pertaining to population. It didn't discuss much about methodology, just basic overviews of what they were studying. Up to this point, as of 1979, most policy research had analyzed existing processes and policies instead of projecting on or prescribing new ones. There were studies concerning international migration, uh, and the first was this International Migration Project, which was numerous studies that were concerned with the patterns and trends of labor and migration in the Middle East and North Africa. Then it discussed King's problems of return migration, in which he stated that every migration stream has a counter stream, and that returning migrants bring little innovation or impact on economic development. Next, it talked about U.S. population redistribution. There was a study for the National Academy of Sciences in order to assist in allocating resources for research concerning problems in U.S. cities, and it demonstrated patterns of population redistribution that were undermining longstanding economic and political balances. Then it talked about Barber's paper on urban population distribution being affected by selection of employment sites, and Adams' paper on how urban policies have affected metropolitan dynamics. Then it spoke about how at the time of this reading, there was a move by political or by population geographers to study processes rather than patterns, from microanalysis to macroanalysis to microanalysis. And it talked about Morgan's study on how population's preference for residential locations can be used as a strategy for population growth. Then it discussed urban population turnover studies in Britain. There was research by Short, and he questioned techniques such as correlation and multiple regression analysis in studying population turnover. And he also questioned using the British census and migration data because population and housing stock are not static, and really only measure population growth, not turnover. Short suggested using the electoral register, and Woods and another suggested using primary school rolls. Both of these give the advantage of flexibility in time and spatial scales, but they can be very time consuming. The second reading was geovisualization of human activity patterns using 3D GIS. In this, Quan and Lee use a time geography perspective that was first developed by a group of Swedish geographers in 1970. It represents the temporal and spatial travels of an individual over a 24-hour day, referred to as a space-time path, and the 3D graphical representation of this is referred to as a space-time aquarium. Talk about how visualization is based upon the premise that humans learn from graphical images better than textual and numerical data. It's able to handle complex data sets with numerous attributes, and obviously more easily identifies and interprets spatial patterns and relationships. And 3D geovisualization allowed them to be able to represent temporal aspects of data that had been lost in 2D human activity analysis. 3D geovisualization is able to create concrete, realistic representations of urban environments. You can manipulate the attributes of a scene, query data, alter parameters, etc. They set the activity points at XY location, where the Z is the activity start time, and it extrudes from that Z based on the scale of the duration of the activity. The first study was just a simple activity patterns in space-time, and they mapped out activities of white men, non-employment activities of white men. It showed a concentration of activity in a few main areas, and most of these activities were of short duration and were temporally spread out throughout the day. They brought in layers to for contextual purposes. However, this simple representation wouldn't really be enough for comparing, patterns of various activities for a group or patterns of the same activity for multiple groups. They decided to use the second study, which they created 3D density surfaces for kernel estimation concerning workplace, home, and non-employment activities. And the surfaces were overlaid upon each other to identify peaks and troughs. And once once again, for location context, the other layers were brought in. The third study, the second study just based on was spatially based and not temporally spaced. They did the third study that showed both. They used kernel estimation once again to create surfaces that had a time axis and a space axis, and they studied they created surfaces for men and for women, and for the difference in activities between the two, and it showed pretty much a similarity between men and women overall. The fourth study was the space-time aquarium, first created by those Swedish geographers mentioned earlier. There was a they had created the vertical axis as the time of day, and the boundary of the horizontal plane represented the spatial extent. Once again, 2D layers were converted into 3D for location context. They studied the space-time paths of African and Asian Americans, and they observed that ethnic differences in spatial distribution suggests that racial segregation beyond mere residence might be applicable here. However, it's not completely realistic because the space-time paths, the trip ends were connected with straight lines and not actual travel routes due to a lack of route data in the Portland data set. So they did the last study in Lexington, Kentucky, where they had the GPS data, where there were points taken at various locations along each travel route, and they studied the space-time paths of women that don't have children under 16. And by doing this, they were able to prove that they can show distinctive activity travel patterns through these methods. Well, that's about it. Go ahead and go to the group discussion questions. Thank you for your time.